So this chapter is going to be a little odd for us because it's talking about the future in homicide, but our book was published in 2004. So when the text was published, homicide rates were increasing in some cities. And by the end of 2006, AP noted that murder rates were the highest in a decade after many years of decline. So for example, in New York City, officials noted that 35 of the 579 deaths in New York City in 2006 had actually suffered their fatal wounds in the prior year. But even without those deaths, New York City saw a 6% increase over the prior year. If we were to look at current data, 2014 saw a 2% decrease in homicide from 2013. It's very difficult, however, to figure out why people kill because many factors explain human behavior. Authors note that we can make educated guesses about future trends. However, so large urban, densely populated areas may continue to battle increasing homicide rates without radical interventions. So we know that what has been driving some increases in homicides, or what's been changing as far as homicides go, is that we seem to be seeing a lot of confrontational homicides. Arguments in 2014 continue to be a large circumstance category, and they comprise nearly 50% of all homicides. Others argue that many of the murders in poor neighborhoods reflect a lack of hope. As youth in these neighborhoods reach the crime-prone teen years, they tend to face difficulties. Many are young men living in desperation, and they have very few viable options for employment. The only thing they do have is their manhood, and if someone disrespects them, they may have to prove their manhood, and they may often do so with guns. Over 30% of the U.S. population is 50-plus years old, and less than 5% of murderers are older than 54. With an aging population, we could expect to see a decrease in violent crime. It's no easier to predict the future of homicide outside the U.S. In 2005, the murder rate in Ireland was increasing, and this was a result of late-night violence that was growing out of disputes. So again, confrontational violence, confrontational homicide, and situated transactions. Russia's rates were on a downward slide, but are increasing, including serial murders. DNA evidence is very helpful, but it's not as helpful for everyday murders where we already know who the offender is. So in a confrontational homicide, we tend to rely on witnesses to locate and identify perpetrators. DNA databases are helpful with more difficult cases, though. And one thing we do is we can get a John Doe or a DNA warrant. So while we have a DNA profile, if we don't have an actual offender to match it to, we can indict the profile. DNA has also extensively helped people who are wrongfully convicted. In 2004, Bush signed the Justice for All Act, which made it easier for convicted murderers to obtain DNA testing of evidence if it could prove they're innocent. Things like surveillance cameras and technology have helped solve cases. In 2005, Patricia McDermott was murdered in Philadelphia, and the police were able to use more than 50 cameras to trace her steps the day she went missing. A post office camera recorded the murderer as he followed her off a bus and then shot her, and the footage was clear enough for the public to identify the killer. We also have what's called a classification system for serial criminal patterns, and this works to find patterns among different crimes. It runs 24/7 and can detect more nuanced connections than humans can looking at the same data. This could be useful to detect serial killings and to apprehend offenders. So basically looking forward, what should some future studies of homicide look at? Well, one thing we should look at is an examination of the connections between non-lethal violence and murder. So how often is the difference between non-lethal and lethal violence the intention of the offenders, the chosen weapon, or the availability of medical services? We need to continue to examine offenders, victims, and homicide events to understand and develop theory. We have to figure out if the way we're currently categorizing homicides is valuable, and whether or not we could take stranger homicide and break it down into various categories. Cross-cultural and international homicide research could teach us a lot about U.S. homicide. We can make comparisons between U.S. and other countries with similar media violence and gun access. And finally, Fox and Picaro note that as the nation's demographics shift, we should also take that into account. So we have a growing Latino population, and we want to pay attention to how that might be impacting homicide.